Hey everybody, this is a piece from a book titled Revisionism, Essays on the History of Marxist Ideas by Leopold Labetz. This particular essay is titled The Forgotten Philosopher, Abram Deborin. How does somebody say it?
Abram Deborin.
Abram Deborin. And if you study it all in the history of Soviet Marxism, this is an important figure. So that's why I'm reading this. He's the philosopher of what Stalin called Menshevizing idealism, and which is in conflict with the so-called mechanists. So here we go. Avram Moiseyevich Deborin. How's it go again?
Abram Deborin. Abram Deborin.
Abram Deborin. Born in Kovno in Lithuania, the child of poor Jewish parents, belongs unjustly to the forgotten philosophers. Abram Deborin became known in the 20s as the exponent of an individual brand of Marxism oriented in method towards Hegel, and his own work is ultimately bound up with the development of Soviet philosophy. Until the condemnation of his dialectical philosophy in 1931, he was considered the leading Soviet philosopher and was often mentioned in the same breath as Lenin. And Lenin himself included Deborin first, Deborin's first book, titled Introduction to the Philosophy of Dialectical Materialism, written in 1908 and published in 1916 by Plekhanov, among those works which he considered worth thorough study. Abram Deborin's book Philosophical Remains, published by the Marx-Engels-Lenin Institute in Moscow in 1932, contains extracts and marginalia, not always friendly, which reveal his interest in this first Russian exposition of Marxist philosophy. I don't know who he is here. Uh-oh. Today, Deborin and his philosophical work are almost completely forgotten. Although Deborin was elected to the Presidium of the Academy of Sciences of the USSR in 1935, that is, after Deborin's philosophy had been condemned, and remained there as Secretary of the Department for History and Philosophy, the traces of his own activities have been almost completely eliminated from all Soviet philosophical publications. The new Soviet encyclopedia devotes only a few unkind lines to Deborin, who is today living in retirement in Moscow. The sources for Deborin's biography are therefore very scanty and dry up completely after his condemnation. Deborin's life until 1931 is documented in works of reference. Deborin's life since then can only be inferred from occasional references to his membership of scientific institutions and from the very few of his writings published. As there is no accurate information about Deborin's life, any account must depend on what is said in a few reference books and on unconfirmed remarks in the literature on the subject. Deborin left a government Jewish school in Kovno in 1897 and learnt the trade of locksmith. It was in Kovno, too, probably, that Deborin first came into contact with the revolutionary movement. It is probable that at the end of 1899, because of revolutionary activities, Deborin moved to the more remote Kherson in order to escape the clutches of the police. There is evidence of his revolutionary activity there. Like most of the young intellectuals who were later to become prominent in the revolution, Deborin joined an illegal revolutionary circle, and in this group of eagerly debating revolutionaries he laid the foundations of his political and philosophical convictions. But Deborin was soon expelled from Kherson also and returned to his native town. I don't know if I'm saying that name right. Kherson. Sorry, Kherson. In Kovno, Deborin was overtaken by the fate of all Russian revolutionaries. Deborin was arrested for treasonable activities and, after a conditional release, placed under police supervision. A few years later, he escaped from this by fleeing to Switzerland. In Berna, where he spent several years. He joined the Lenin wing of the Russian Social Democrats. At the same time, Deborin completed his education at the university in Berna, where he studied history and philosophy. Deborin's contributions to the Stuttgart Social Democratic periodical Die Neue Zeit, which fall into this period, in style and content, already show all the characteristic features of his later thought. In Deborin's first articles, which incidentally were written in German, the influence of the Hegelian dialectic is unmistakable. The effect of the encounter with Hegel was so profound that at times he falls victim to the mania of many young Hegel enthusiasts and seems determined to force all political events into the Hegelian categories. Deborin, astonishingly widely read, apparently even in his first writings, later also gave direction to his philosophy. Deborin's astonishingly wide reading, apparent and even in his first writings, later also gave direction to his philosophy. Deborin's extensive knowledge of pre-Marxist philosophy led Deborin to attempt, on the one hand, to place Marxism in the historical development of philosophical ideas since Spinoza, and on the other hand, in accordance with the Hegelian triad, to interpret it as the great synthesis of the materialist philosophy of the 18th century with the dialectical elements of German idealism. Marx's achievements in doing this he regarded as the fusion, accomplished for the first time, of the concepts of, quote, matter and, quote, dialectic into a unified dynamic philosophy. A far-ranging preoccupation with the history of philosophy very soon led Deborin to the conviction that Marxism could become an historical force only if, again completely in the Hegelian manner, it absorbed all the progressive elements of pre-Marxist philosophy. According to this interpretation, the essence of Marxism could only fulfill itself by preserving all the lasting cognitions of the human spirit. Full of this idea, Deborin did not tire of exploring French, English, and especially German philosophy for materialist and dialectical elements. It is therefore not surprising that the central theme of Deborin's first work, written in exile, is the dialectic. Deborin began to prepare a history of the dialectic, tracing it from Spinoza through Kant, Fichte, and Hegel to Marx, which is as characteristic of his work as his later attempt at systematization in the realm of the natural sciences. Given this interpretation of Marxism, it was only logical that Deborin, in spite of all his respect for Lenin's political and organizing genius, should not attribute any special importance to his philosophy. The Bolshevik version of a, quote, Leninist stage of philosophy found no place in Deborin's far-ranging speculations. Among Russian Marxists, Deborin felt a bond only with the kindred spirit, G.V. Plekhanov. To support his ideas, he always refers to Plekhanov alone and makes him his chief witness. Lenin, on the other hand, appears in Deborin's work only as the great theoretician of the revolution. The philosophical development, in addition to political differences, helps to explain why Deborin parted company with the Bolsheviks in 1907 and joined the Mensheviks. The suggestion that Deborin's break with the Lenin wing arose as a result of far-reaching differences of opinion is supported by the fact that after the October Revolution, Deborin continued to remain in the ranks of the Menshevik Party and joined the Bolshevik Party only very much later, in 1928. Yeah, this seems like a very important thing, is that like it seems like almost kind of like the best minds of Bolshevism, or at least some of the best minds of Bolshevism, were in the Menshevik Party, Menshevik wing until after the revolution. So even like Trotsky, right? Trotsky wasn't like a Menshevik. He was kind of I think it was called the Mezryancy, which were like the between, kind of like between parties, kind of like not in between them. It's like I think Mezryancy means like interdistrict. It's like between them. But I believe Isaac Ilyich Rubin was a Menshevik, and so was David Ryazanov. So that's interesting. In 1908, Deborin returned to Russia. In the years that followed, he led the restless, roving life of all Russian professional revolutionaries, which took Deborin to, among other places, Warsaw, St. Petersburg, and Poltava. The account of the influence of the October Revolution on his political convictions contradict one another. Some sources claim that he made a complete break with Menshevism. Deborin himself also put it this way, while others maintain that he continued to be a member of the Menshevik Party. The only undisputed fact is that after a short political interlude as chairman of the Poltava city Soviet in 1917, Deborin retired from active political life and devoted himself to teaching. Um, and this is kind of, this. I mean, I'm sure it'll say this, but this is the thing that I'm like know from Deborin is kind of is that his philosophy, while dominant up until a point, I think until like 1931, his philosophy becomes dominant in like the as he like like people that kind of follow him, kind of get appointed to all the um, important posts in academia in the Soviet Union in the late 1920s, and that end comes to an end in 1931 when he's labeled with his philosophy. It's labeled uh, Menshevizing idealism. And then that follows by, I think that the next person to follow him up is like the main philosophy guy, and he stays in this position for a while, is M.D. Mitten, who I should also find a secondary source on. Anyway. Deborin taught at the Sverdlov University in Moscow, and among the many honors bestowed on him were membership of the Institute of Red Professors, the Marx Engels Institute, and the Communist Academy. In addition to his teaching activities, Deborin devoted himself to publishing the most important works of materialist philosophy. Deborin edited for the quote, Library of Materialists and the quote, Library of Atheism the works of Holbach, Helvetius, Lamettrie, Toland, Diderot, and Hobbes. The complete edition of Hegel that he had planned suspended in 1930 was intended, together with the works of Feuerbach, which he had already edited, to make the two most important forerunners of Marxist philosophy accessible to the Russian reader. Deborin was torn from these teachings and editing activities in the mid-20s by a philosophical discussion which resulted from his interpretation of Marxism and drew him again into political controversy. In the first half of the 20s, the principles of Marxist philosophy had by no means been fully elaborated. After the liberating experience of the revolution, the most dissimilar materialist currents had formed an essential emotional alliance. All these philosophical movements were drawn toward one another by the feeling that they were all called upon to provide spiritual guidance for the revolutionary materialist society. Each of the sects worked more or less in the conviction that the new world which had to be built would correspond to its ideas, and none took too seriously the contradictory utterances of the others. Before the great practical task, theoretical differences faded into insignificance. One second. This apparent unanimity in the early phase of the revolution was shaken for the first time in 1922 by the appearance of a programmatic article by O. Minin, a fairly primitive materialist who demanded the liquidation of philosophy in the Soviet Union. Minin started by saying that Soviet philosophy was a bourgeois survival and must be replaced by the positive sciences. This article was followed in quick succession by a number of articles and pamphlets written by materialist-minded natural scientists who were unanimous in their demand that the remnants of philosophy should be replaced by the positive sciences. These vociferous demands naturally brought opponents onto the scene. Quote, vulgar materialism, as this crude version was called, was spread so fast and gaining so much influence, particularly among students, that even Bukharin, then the party's chief ideologist, was forced to deal with this phenomenon. In 1923, he intervened in the controversy and sharply condemned vulgar materialism. Which is very interesting because, like, when you think of like vulgar materialism, you think of one of the people, not vulgar necessarily, but the more mechanical interpretation, the more reductionist version of materialism. One of the most extreme examples of that, to my understanding at least, I haven't read the book myself, but if you read like the secondary literature, one of the most extreme examples of that is Bukharin's book, Historical Materialism, which is critiqued from heavily in like the Western Marxism. So like Lukács criticizes it very strongly, and so does Gramsci apparently. And I'm just basing that on what I know of the secondary literature. At Bukharin's side, there was Deborin, who contributed a series of brilliant articles attacking vulgar materialism. His opposition, however, was expressed less in criticism of its theoretical premises than in the elaboration of a philosophically oriented program, which by its scope alone made vulgar materialism appear intellectually provincial. The theoretical resources of the vulgar materialists were insufficient for a serious controversy. The movement, which apart from O. Minin, centered particularly on the biologist Emanuel S. Enchman, who preached a peculiar form of philosophy which he tried to reduce to biology, was soon replaced by a number of persons who had to be taken seriously. Among them, to name only the most influential, were Ivan Ivanovich Skvortsov-Stepanov, who lived from 1870 to 1928, Arkady Clement Timiryazev, who lived from 1880 to 1955, the son of the famous Russian physiologist, and Lyubov Isakovna Axelrod, who lived from 1868 to 1946. The new movement differed both from its vulgar materialist precursors and from the mechanical materialism of the 18th century. To distinguish themselves from their predecessors, its members called themselves mechanistic materialists. And it's hard to say what, just based upon the name, precisely what is meant. But when I think of something being mechanistic, it's not like a style. It refers to like if mechanistic, I kind of put into contrast with organic, right? So organic and mechanistic, there's kind of ways that those are talked about, kind of like in terms of style or like approach, which is a legitimate way to, I think is a fine way to use those terms in a lot of ways. But I think usually what organic means is that when something's organic, at least to me, I usually think of it meaning like mutually reciprocal causation, right? Whereas like you can't just sort of reduce everything. Like mechanism tries to find like find like a first starter or like a prime mover. That's like the main thing that causes everything else downstream of it, right? So like I think a lot of times, like a mechanistic conception of the universe, usually to my like when I think of that, I usually think of like ideas that say something to the effect of like God or some like first mover set the world in motion and then just let it go, and cease to cause it. Like that was like God or something like that was like the first cause, right? And then everything that happens after that cause of the creation, um, kind of all kind of stems from that core event. There's like the first mover, right? Which is about kind of like, which if you can think of that as like reductionist, right? So if you think of something like being like, um, reductionist, like the economy causes everything else that happens in society. So everything from like the poetry that's in vogue, or like the political forms or the laws that are passed, or all kind of have some kind of immediate bridge. There's some immediate causal bridge between the economy and those so-called like superstructural events, right? Like that would be an example. So like real stern, really dogmatic, like base superstructure uh, scheme conceptions of Marxism, I would say, or fall on that mechanistic side, um, right? So whereas organic, an organic conception seems to be a little bit more oriented towards like reciprocal causation. So like organic, if you think of like the body, right? Um, it's a system, right? When something has a systematic character, that means things are mutually reinforcing and reciprocate one another, and the absence of one of them would create the preconditions for the non-existence or the dysfunctioning of another, right? So like if you're thinking of like capitalism, right, you might say that like commodities, money, capital, all kind of um, support and reproduce each other's as like their social um, uh, their social what's the word their social function, right? Or like you might say with the body, right? That's the organic. You think of life, right? When you think of something having life, um, if you're talking about like different aspects of like an organism, like the various systems of a body, right? They all kind of mutually reinforce each other, and you know, it's difficult to say like which is the like one that causes everything else, right? Or like the thing that's like the more substantial layer, right? Or there's no kind of like epiphenomenal thing. It's not um, like the blood, for instance, or like the circulatory system can have effects on the nervous system, right? And the nervous system like can have effects on like the circulatory system, right? There's no kind of thing where like this thing causes, but isn't doesn't have any causes pushed back down on it. That's how I typically think of mechanism. Mechanism is like in contrast to organicism. So in this particular instance, I think of mechanistic materialism being like very kind of um, reductionist in terms of like an extreme form would be like an extreme form of mechanistic Marxism would be extremely like technological reductionist, based upon what's it, the foreword to the 1859 a contribution to the critique of political economy, if I'm thinking correctly, like instance, or I think it actually might be the quote. The main quote might be from the Poverty of Philosophy, which is like to the like oh, this type of technology gives you this mode of production, and this type of technology gives you another mode of production. So, like, capitalism is kind of like reduced to like its physiological, or like not physiological, but like physical substratum of production, right? The technical apparatus, as opposed to like the social relations, um, you know, dictating orienting what happens in production, right? Um, or just having it be like a one-way street. Um, And then I suppose you could have like another mechanistic, another reductionism, right? Which just says everything's a social relation. There is no actual kind of like physical substratum of existence that's causally relevant, right? Um, that would be another form of reductionism. So I don't know if reductionism and mechanism are the same thing, but I usually think of it as like mechanism being like referring to the relationship. Yeah, this is a good one. A relationship between parts and wholes. A reductive relationship between parts and wholes, right? Anyway, sorry, I'm thinking out loud about like I'm thinking about that's me writing to myself. The mechanistic group carried on the traditions of vulgar materialism in a very different form. It disputed the right of philosophy to exist in a socialist society with the following argument. Just as after the establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat, Russian society had conquered all the irrational and blind forces whose victim it had been during the bourgeois capitalist phase of its history. It had established a rational, controlled, and planned social order, so it must free itself from all philosophical rubbish in the realms of science and culture to make way for the positive sciences. Only by abandoning all philosophical fictions, the mechanists believe, would the transition from the old bourgeois society to a new scientific epoch of history be completed. They were thus trying to establish a scientific Weltanschauung, or worldview, which was to be derived from the summarizing and elucidating the findings of the positivist sciences. In explaining all material and spiritual phenomena, they adopted a strict determinism and strongly denied the right to existence of a philosophy distinct from the individual sciences. Analysis was the method by which they hoped to penetrate to the ultimate mysteries of being, and since for them the laws of the microcosm applied also to the macrocosm, they believed that by penetrating into the smallest particles they would be able to solve general problems of nature and society, a universalist method such as the dialectic seemed to them to be simply scholasticism. In the summer of 1925, the mechanists began openly attacking, quote, bourgeois survivals in the Soviet Union. The occasion was furnished by Ryazanov's edition of Engels' book Dialectics of Nature, which was published in 1925. I think that was like the first publication of Engels' Dialectic of Nature. I don't think Dialectics of Nature came out until like this period. Stepanov published a commentary on this book in which he maintained that Engels had proved that in socialist society only exact science remained. The dialectic of which Engels spoke was nothing but a familiar theory of evolution. But Deborin, again, against whom Stepanov's article was directed, could with good reason cite Engels in his defense. After all, it was precisely in this book that Engels had tried to make the dialectic the necessary methodological foundation of the natural sciences. The controversy between Deborin and Stepanov therefore began over the question of the place Engels attributed to the dialectic in the natural sciences and to philosophy in a socialist society. Engels' unfinished work, which exists only as a fragment, grotesquely enough provided both parties with a justification of their position. The contradictions in numerous intellectual ambiguous passages produced a situation in which both sides fought for years on end over the meaning of individual sentences and phrases. When Deborin appeared to be getting the upper hand, the mechanists began to divide Engels' intellectual development into two phases. They asserted that a part of the notes dated from a period when Engels was still caught up in bourgeois philosophical prejudices. Deborin could be referring only to these immature and pre-scientific passages. In the second stage of his development, Engels had understood his mistakes and had tried to eliminate philosophy and dialectics from the natural sciences. From this point of view, the quarrel between Deborin and the mechanists can be regarded as a controversy over the views of Engels. Marx was allowed almost no say at all. His ideas were unambiguously expressed and hardly referred to the question under dispute. But Engels, in whose work materialist and idealist traditions were only very loosely interwoven, and who had died while trying to expand the historical materialism of his friend Marx into a comprehensive dialectical materialism, had left behind a great quality from which Deborinists and mechanists could help themselves to powerful arguments. The fact that Deborin and his views finally prevailed did not remove the stumbling block. The ambivalence of this work of Engels later provided the natural scientists of the Soviet Union with effective quotations to defend themselves against the attempt to fetter research by dogmatic philosophy. To the mechanistic interpretation of Engels, which in its extreme form was tantamount to the abolition of philosophy and dialectics as subjects to be studied and taught in the Soviet Union, Deborin opposed his idea of the inseparable link between the philosophy of dialectical materialism and a socialist order of society. According to this guarantee for a scientifically planned society lay entirely in a scientifically worked out philosophy whose function it was to prepare rules and norms by which society, state, and politics could be directed. The denial of Marxist philosophy as the Supreme Court of Appeal would inevitably emasculate Soviet society. Deborin emphasized that historically philosophy had always been one of the most important elements of state and society, and that therefore socialist society too must, for good or ill, remain bound up with Marxist philosophy. Without a clear theoretical concept of the future ordering of society, there could be no purposeful quest for it in practical politics. Without responsible and scientific control of social and political development by philosophy, everything remained at the mercy of arbitrary, spontaneous impulses. With similar arguments, he attacked the demand for the absolute autonomy of the positive sciences. The call for a self-sufficient science was to him synonymous with the renunciation of Marxist philosophy. For Deborin was convinced that the natural sciences too were irrevocably bound up by certain philosophical assumptions. They revealed their hidden workings only when the results were interpreted. as philosophy and science were inescapably coupled with the connection, would have to be, excuse me, as philosophy and science were inescapably coupled, the connection would have to be admitted, explicitly recognized, and utilized to control the results. And as the sciences could not free themselves completely from philosophical implications, it is the task of the scientific philosophy of Marxism to act as its incorruptible conscience and to fight unscientific undercurrents in the sciences. Deborin opposed particularly violently the attempt to eliminate the dialectic as methodological basis in the natural sciences. Closely following Hegel, he considered the dialectical method to be logic, ontology, and theory of cognition in one. And this is very interesting that he says that this is being said here about this kind of like, because this is one of the debates is about, or like the distinctions between like Western Marxism in like at least like of like, which basically means Lukács almost, and Korsch, to a lesser extent, but primarily Lukács. Lukács criticizes Hegel and Engels for attributing the dialectic to non-human spheres, to nature, not to society and social processes, but to nature. And one of the things that, and kind of like, which is for Lukács, to my understanding, is like it was something that was specific to human societies, and about the relationship between self, or like a subject and object, as opposed to some kind of universal law of the cosmos. In Russell Jacoby's, which I think is where I got this article, in Russell Jacoby's Dialectic of Defeat, he makes a distinction between two different uses of Hegel. So on the one, he says like, basically, like Western Marxism does have its roots in Hegelianism, like that's 100% true. But there's also the Hegel of like Soviet Marxism or Orthodox Marxism or dogmatic Marxism. You probably just say Soviet Marxism. I think Soviet Marxism might be what you'd actually say. But they have their so-called, the Western Marxists have like the historical Hegel, which focuses on whose main point of reference in his work, for according to Jacoby, is the Phenomenology of Spirit by Hegel, which he calls the Marxism that's influenced by that heavily the historical Hegel, and then like the Hegel that's more influenced by like the logic, the science of logic, and I guess like the encyclopedia logic. The Encyclopedia of Philosophical Science is the so-called minor logic or whatever, as being like the preferred text of like so-called the scientific Hegel, which is not used like which scientific Hegel being the Hegel of choice for Soviet Marxism. And for Jacoby, obviously people have used the science of logic to discuss things like Marxist Capital and the method in that, and the exposition and the relationship between different parts of this overarching whole of political, the critique of political economy. But he talks about kind of like the science, which I think is a way like a lot of people are used to talking about Hegel now in Marxism, because of like the Hegel influence reading of the critique of political economy, right? But he talks about the scientific Hegel more as like Hegel's work, particularly I suppose this is in the Encyclopedia of Philosophical Sciences, about like Hegel's like philosophy of nature, right? And this kind of like Marxist Weltanschauung philosophy of nature being what is like the Hegel that was significant for Soviet Marxism. And and he talks about how even more so than probably like the science of logic, like the first part of what the Encyclopedia of Philosophical Sciences. He's referring to the third part. The third part of the Encyclopedia of Sciences, Philosophical Sciences, particularly about like Hegel's like developed like philosophy of nature. But like the main distinction, I guess you would say that like seems to be what um, Jacobi, following I guess like Lukács and other people, would be to like make this distinction between like the historical Hegel, which is about like the um, I don't know, self-realization of absolute spirit, or like the self-realization of freedom, or like self-consciousness, humanity coming into full self-consciousness of itself, or something like that, um, versus the Hegel of like um, I don't know, rigid system or something like that. Uh, one of the earmarks of Hegel in like his logic is that like when he's talking about like the science of logic, when he's talking about like these metaphysical concepts, being, essence, shit like that, he's not just talking about like uh, some kind of like way of thinking, right, or some kind of method for approaching the particular sciences, social sciences, um, natural sciences, what have you. But he's saying that like no, this is like the fundamental like nature of reality. Like his logic is like a logic of the cosmos, as opposed, and so uh, this kind of like ontology, which is a one which is or ontologic, is kind of like the aspect of Hegel that's kind of picked up in Soviet philosophy. And a lot of people say that despite the official ruling against Hegel in the Soviet Union, which comes to be, where Hegel's just viewed as like a straight up reactionary and precursor to fascism and all of this kind of all these things. Um, uh, the underlying premises of Soviet diamat remain like deeply bastardized Hegelianism in like a bastardized form, or remain an instance of like a particular reading of Hegel. It remains Hegelian despite itself, in like a dogmatic or like unself-conscious way. Anyway, where the hell am I? Deborin opposed particularly violently the attempt to eliminate the dialectic as methodological basis in the natural sciences. Closely following Hegel, he considered the dialectical method to be logic, ontology, and theory of cognition in one. To suppress it in the individual sciences meant for him to give up a uniform and complete order of being. And since for him the dialectic represented an ontological principle governing all realms of life, its elimination from the natural sciences would lead to methodological confusion, in which the results of research into the individual sciences would inevitably be frittered away and could no longer be integrated into a self-contained whole. For 5 years, from 1925 to 1929, the controversy before the Deborinists and the mechanists revolved around these questions. Much ink was spilt on both sides, but neither party retreated. The Deborinists, who included Y. E. Sten, N. A. Karev, B. N. Gessen, V. F. Asmus, I. K. Lupol, I. Agal, M. L. Levin, I. Podvolotsky, S. Levitt, F. Telezhnikov, S. Novikov, and many others during these years became widely known as the quote, dialectical school. They agreed among themselves on the things they published, quoted each other, and for the rest followed the leader without question. Their main organizational support, apart from scientific institutes and universities, where according to contemporary reports they held almost all the key positions, came from the Society of Militant Materialists founded in 1924. In 1928, this society amalgamated with a splinter group under the name of Society of Militant Materialists and Dialecticians. In 1929, the society directed by Deborin already had an organizational network which covered almost the whole of Russia. Its object, as Deborin put it, was to, quote, organize the systematic investigation of the Hegelian dialectic from the standpoint of Marxism, end quote. With this aim in view, the society initiated a Hegelian renaissance in the Soviet Union, which very soon degenerated into a Hegel cult. The publicity organ of the Deborinists was the periodical under the banner of Marxism, which existed from 1922 to 1944, which was translated into several languages and whose chief editor from 1926 to 1930 was Deborin. It had a direct influence on the course of the controversy, as almost all disputed questions were discussed in it. Although until 1930 the journal followed the Deborinist line, it did not close its columns to its philosophical opponents. It was run in such a way that the most divergent points of view could find relatively free expression in it. Although Deborin was appointed editor-in-chief only in 1926, Deborin's influence is apparent in all leading articles of the preceding years. With a few exceptions, all of Deborin's writings after the Revolution appeared under the banner of Marxism, and they alone gave under the banner of Marxism the unmistakable stamp which soon made it into a concept in the intellectual life of the Soviet Union. Deborin wrote that, in spite of the enormous load of work on his shoulders, Lenin, during the brief space of life left to him, concerned himself untiringly with all the questions connected with the journal, and was able, by suggestion and proposals, to fill the editorial board with his spirit, so that fundamentally the periodical was his creation, Lenin's creation. An examination of Deborin's philosophical attitude, as outlined above, shows that it contains ideas which in the 1920s must have been extremely welcome to the Bolshevik Party. In the realm of politics, Deborin's theory of the dialectical leaps in development has a close affinity to the ideas of the party, which found in it the philosophical confirmation of its hopes for international revolution. The mechanistic theory of evolution could hardly have met with approval during the 1920s. Moreover, one only had to pursue Deborin's theory of the inevitable connection between philosophy, society, and science through to its logical conclusion, with the party's task in mind to find in it a cleverly disguised device for using philosophy to control society and science unobtrusively and effectively. The theoretical leadership of society and science, which he demanded for the philosophers, encouraged the idea of the party's practical leadership in those fields. Not only did he draw up the ideal blueprint of control, but he also took the first practical steps in that direction. In opposing all spontaneous impulses, for which he demanded prior philosophical sanction, he initiated their practical control. Unintentionally, he thus prepared the method of social and political control from above, of which the party was later to make clever use. Moreover, the primacy of the dialectical method, which he finally succeeded in establishing against the opposition of the natural scientists, offered the opportunity, which could not be ignored, of suppressing all undesirable developments in the individual sciences. Here too he paved the way for the party's later social and political practices. It is not surprising, therefore, that the Deborinists were given effective support in their fight against the mechanists. Later on, this philosophical struggle provided an opportunity to link the mechanists with the right-wing deviators of those years, Bukharin, Rykov, Tomsky, and thus to seal the philosophical verdict by a political one. When the second All-Union Conference of Marxist-Leninist Research Institutes opened in the Communist Academy in Moscow on the 8th of April 1929, the mechanists found themselves at a disadvantage. As the majority of the 229 delegates belonged in any case to the Deborinist faction, the support of the party was not needed to damn mechanistic materialism as a, quote, obvious deviation from the position of Marxist-Leninist philosophy, end quote. In his report to the conference, Deborin once again summarized the points at issue. The crux of the controversy he continued to see in the mechanist's refusal to recognize the use of dialectics as compulsory in the natural sciences. With undiminished violence, Deborin accused Timiryazev and his followers of still not understanding that the crisis in modern natural science was caused by a crisis in fundamental methodological principles. Quote, "We maintained," he said to the conference, quote, "that the law of the unity of opposites must be made the basis of theoretical physics. Our opponents thereby accused us of idealism, scholasticism, and every other deadly sin. Comrade Timiryazev called me the, quote, liquidator of the natural sciences, end quote. Who, if not Comrade Timiryazev, should guard the natural sciences against our plots?" End quote. Before he attacked the mechanistic charge that he had forced the dialectical method on the natural sciences, and had therefore dictated laws to nature instead of inducing them from it, quote, "Comrade Timiryazev's ideas about Marxism are as confused as ideas about Hegel's dialectic," end quote. He said to the mechanist, quote, "Like all mechanists, he completely fails to understand the reciprocal connection between theory and practice. He believes in empiricism proceeding at a snail's pace and, quote, quivostism, and denies the role of the dialectic as a tool of research," end quote. Deborin. Apparently that word of quivostism, this is a footnote, says Lenin's term denoting lagging in the, quote, tail of events. I think they usually that means like tailism is usually translated as tailism, I think, in English. With the condemnation of the mechanists, who included, in addition to Timiryazev and Axelrod, A. Varyash, V.L. Sarabianov, Perov, Galikman, T.A. Seitlin, and others, Deborin reached the peak of his influence on Soviet philosophy. In Deborin's journal, he noted with satisfaction that communist society had pronounced the final verdict. This verdict, passed by the most distinguished scientists in the country, must satisfy everybody. Deborin's philosophical victory and his personal triumph over the mechanists were effectively complemented by an increase in institutional power. Deborin's position as editor-in-chief of the journal under the banner of Marxism in those years, the only philosophical journal, was confirmed by the conference. In addition, Deborin directed the Institute of Philosophy of the Communist Academy, was a member of the Presidium of that academy, deputy director of the Marx-Engels Institute, and after 1929, also an ordinary member of the Academy of Sciences of the USSR. Furthermore, he was responsible for the philosophical section of the first Soviet encyclopedia, which had started appearing in 1926 under the overall editorship of his friend O. Y. Schmidt. This enabled him to exercise a direct influence on the shape of the encyclopedia, which played an extremely important part in forming political opinion in the Soviet Union. Until 1930, all the philosophical articles appearing in the encyclopedia bear the stamp of Deborin's editorship. The Deborinists also controlled the philosophical department of the state publishing house, which enabled them to examine all important theoretical publications. Another advantageous result of the Second All-Union Conference was the reform of Timiryazev's Scientific Research Institute in Moscow, until then under the control of the mechanists, the directorship of which was given to the Deborinist I.I. Agol. A survey of the development of Soviet philosophy up to 1929 shows that the Deborinists were not only victorious in all disputed questions, but also managed to secure a large organizational network. The greater philosophical self-confidence of the Deborinists, which had been the result of the Second All-Union Conference and the claim to leadership which they made soon afterwards, soon spoiled their relations with the party. In 1929, however, the party was still busy with other tasks. In the year of the, quote, great turn on all fronts of socialist construction, end quote, it was first of all necessary to break the opposition inside the party to the policy of forced industrialization and collectivization. Nikolai Bukharin, a member of the Politburo, Rykov, then Soviet Prime Minister, and Tomsky, at the head of the trade unions, had come out against Stalin's policy of intensifying the class struggle. It should be in quotes. What could be more obvious in such a situation than to establish a connection between the, quote, rightist deviation in politics and the, quote, rightist deviation in philosophy? The spectacle of 5 years of controversy must have drawn the attention of even the least interested observer to the differences of opinion on the, quote, philosophical front. After all, the mechanist had been condemned as an evolutionary positivist element, which in political terminology meant, quote, rightist deviation, end quote. The arguments used in the philosophical controversy offered themselves as a political weapon in the fight against all opposition to Stalin's general line of 1929. It was no coincidence that the elimination of the mechanist took place at the same time as the elimination of the Bukharin, Rykov, and Tomsky group. Bukharin was accused of mechanism in philosophy, and in April 1929 lost his position as president of the Communist International. In November 1929, he was expelled from the Politburo. This being the state of affairs, it was clear that the alliance between the party ideologists and the Deborinists could only be of short duration. In 1930, the, quote, philosophical front presented a completely different picture. The controversy between the Deborinists and the mechanists concerned the philosophical foundations of Marxism, in which a subtler way of presenting arguments could only have a disturbing and hampering effect. So long as the foundations of Soviet philosophy were not clearly defined, a third ideological position could hardly be established without impeding or even preventing the process of clarification which was just beginning. After Deborin's success at the conference, things changed. There was now only one philosophical line of which the party could expect that, after winning a brilliant philosophical victory, it would show the same intellectual brilliance in the execution of real tasks. But the hopes which the party had put in Deborin remained unfulfilled. In the new situation, it became clear that Deborin's dialectical philosophy had rather aristocratic characteristics, and that its representatives were not prepared to give immediate sanction to the party's practical measures. They continued to look upon Soviet philosophy, which they represented and wanted to purge of all non-Marxist elements and preserve in complete purity, as the highest and ultimate criterion of truth of social and political development. They continued to regard all concrete phenomena of Soviet society, insofar as they paid any attention to them at all, only from the point of view of Marxist theory and the Hegelian dialectic. After the condemnation of the mechanists, the truce in Soviet philosophy lasted just a year, or more accurately until the joint session of the Institute of Philosophy of the Communist Academy and the Moscow organization of the Society of Militant Materialists and Dialecticians held from April 20th to the 24th of 1930. Deborin gave the main speech and presided over the discussion which followed. At the beginning of the conference, Deborin still had good reason to believe that his philosophical ideas, which he had successfully defended against the mechanists, would continue to have the approval of the party. But by the end of the conference, this had become more than doubtful. During the discussion, it emerged that the anti-Deborin regrouping was taking place. That an anti-Deborin regrouping was taking place among Soviet philosophers. Deborin's report on, quote, results and talks on the philosophical front, end quote, was attacked and criticized with surprising violence by a small group. Characteristically, the new group did not criticize any concrete point of the analysis given in the report, but made a general attack on the Deborinists' claim to be the leaders of philosophy. This is a completely new attitude. It was not directed against this or that point of dialectical philosophy. It did not seize on any theoretical problem, but while accepting Deborin's theoretical arguments, nevertheless aimed at the removal of the Deborinists. Immediately after the discussion of after the discussion, Deborin commented that it was less a question of theoretical opposition to his philosophy than of the appearance of a new group, which defied exact definition, and apparently wanted to obtain control of the philosophical field, a group which, as he put it, was, quote, thirsting for power, end quote. Deborin. In Deborin's final speech to the conference, Deborin dealt with the arguments of his new opponents and announced that he would resist any attempt to discredit the philosophical leadership and to wrest it from his followers. Quote, some comrades have said, your general line is correct, we don't want to break up the philosophical leadership. But on the other hand, they have pursued a line which was aimed precisely at suppressing and discrediting the philosophical leadership. We shall fight against this. Why shall we fight? Naturally not because we cling to the leadership in philosophy, but because what the splinter group has said shows evidence of unhealthy symptoms. End quote. Deborin. Thus began the struggle between the Deborinists and the party ideologists for the control of Soviet philosophy. In April 1930, the new group was not yet able to set its way against the Deborinists. Although Deborin had met a new and incomparably more dangerous opponent, the resolution, quote, concerning the results and new tasks on the philosophical front, quote, which he introduced, was adopted by an overwhelming majority of the conference. There was only one vote against it. The decisive turning point occurred some months later, the occasion being a semi-official article published in Pravda on June 7, 1930, written by three then still unknown party ideologists: Mark Borisovich Mitin, born 1901, Pavel Fedorovich Yudin, born 1899, and Vasil Nikiforovich Rotsevich. They came from the Institute of Red Professors and therefore had an influential institution behind them. Mitin and Yudin were the heads of the Institute party organization. They thus represented a new type in the philosophical controversy, which until then had been fought by scholars. The party ideologists justified their criticism of Soviet philosophy by reference to the approach of the 16th Party Congress and the great practical tasks that it would present to the theoreticians. Quote, reality is confronting theory with tremendous problems, end quote, they wrote. Quote, it is necessary to start at once the preparation and theoretical generalization of these problems on the basis of Marxist-Leninist methodology. Instead, we notice the theory is lagging considerably behind, end quote. This accusation was obviously directed at Deborin and his school. They heaped reproach after reproach on official Soviet philosophy, accusing it of a lack of party-mindedness and of political neutrality, and imputing to it extreme formalism and the malicious separation of philosophy from the practical problems of the country. Their attack culminated in the demand that new tasks be formulated for philosophy, envisaging a fight on two fronts. The philosophical equivalent of, quote, rightist deviation in politics had been found in mechanistic materialism, now under the banner of a fight on two philosophical fronts. The party ideologists tried to establish the philosophical equivalent of, quote, leftist deviation, that is, of Trotskyism, only if it could be proved that the leftist deviation represented a whole system which would penetrate into the official philosophy, and of which there must therefore necessarily be a social equivalent. Could the party claim that its ruthless procedure against the Trotskyists was fully justified? What was more obvious for the purpose after the equation of mechanism with, quote, rightist deviation had proved so successful than to say that Deborinism was the philosophical basis of Trotskyism? If Deborinism could be identified with Trotskyism, Deborin and his, quote, dialectical school would be unmasked as forming an anti-state and anti-party movement, and the philosophical foundations of Trotskyism would be laid bare. Though cautiously phrased, the article did indeed accuse Deborin of Trotskyism. Quote, fully aware of the great importance which the fight against mechanism has played in strengthening Marxist-Leninist theory, we cannot, as some comrades are trying to do, pass over the shortcomings and mistakes which have occurred in communist philosophy in the past period of development. One of the major inadequacies has proved to be that in its development, Marxist-Leninist philosophy has failed to unmask the theoretical foundations of Trotskyism. End quote. As the development of Marxist-Leninist philosophy, end quote, had until then been in Deborin's hands, the implication was obvious. Retrospectively, it can be seen after the publication of the semi-official article of June 7, 1930, the Deborinists were pushed on the defensive. Subjectively, however, they did not feel themselves to be on the defensive at all. On the contrary, they published a strong criticism of the new ideas. The May number of their periodical, under the banner of Marxism, contained a counter-declaration signed by the most prominent representatives of dialectical philosophy. Their answer to the criticism in Pravda was produced with surprising self-confidence and was still written completely in the tone of, quote, philosophical leaders, end quote. In the introduction, they said, quote, Pravda of June 7th of this year contained an article by comrades M. Mitten, V. Rautsevich, and P. Yudin, entitled Concerning the New Tasks of Marxist-Leninist Philosophy. This article presents a correct interpretation neither of the present situation in the realm of Marxist-Leninist philosophy nor of the tasks which confront us. As the article touches upon extremely important topical questions, we believe it necessary to examine these in greater detail. End quote. Deborin. So I don't know why I said Deborin. Mitten, Rautsevich, and P. Yudin. The Deborinists pointed out that everything which was correct in the article of the three-party ideologists was simply a restatement of their own philosophical views. Quote, but they continued, quote, where the authors of the article express their own views, they depart from the correct Marxist-Leninist position, end quote. While the party ideologists had defined mechanism and Trotskyism as the two fronts in which Soviet philosophy must fight, the Deborinists now added, quote, formalism and eclecticism, end quote, as a new front, putting the article of the party ideologist into this category. It is surprising that in their defense the Deborinists said nothing about the Trotskyism of which they had been obliquely accused. This is the more surprising as they examined all the other accusations in detail and pulled them to pieces with the skill they had already demonstrated many times before. Either they were so involved in their traditional ways of putting problems that, conscious of their services in the fight against mechanism, they dismissed as unimportant the accusation of not having done their duty of political supervision in one instance, or they were aware of an unfortunate omission in this question, which they tried to pass over in silence. Another explanation might be that there was really an unadmitted elective affinity between Deborin's philosophy and Trotsky's political theories. The far-ranging learning, the delight in rhetorical glitter and stylistic form, the internationalist orientation and receptivity, even if critical, for the ideas of Western Europe, which characterize both Deborinists and Trotskyists, makes it possible to compare them on the basis of an intellectual, psychological, elective affinity. But beyond this, there is no proof of the existence of any close political or philosophical connection as claimed by the party. Whatever the truth, the fact that the party very soon gave official support to the article of June 7th decided the outcome of the controversy. Moreover, making the attitude of the article its own provided the party with a specific point of view on all philosophical questions. It could now fall back on a philosophy whose creed was the unconditional support of the party's practical measures with philosophical arguments. However strongly the Deborinists defended themselves, and however good and convincing their arguments, they lost influence steadily. In the September 1930 issue of their journal, they were made to publish a resolution directed against themselves. It appeared on the last page without comment and marks the end of the phase during which the journal was directed in the spirit of Deborin's dialectical philosophy. The September number was the last to be produced by the old editors. The next number appeared but only after Deborin's dismissal in January 1931, under the new direction of V.V. Adoratsky, M.B. Mitten, and P.F. Yudin. The elimination of Deborin's dialectical philosophy from Soviet intellectual life was accomplished in two resolutions which followed each other in quick succession. First, the resolution of the party cell of the Institute of Red Professors of December 29, 1930, taken as a result of Stalin's personal initiative, which subjected Deborin's views to devastating criticism, and second, the decision of the Central Committee of the CPSU of January 25, 1931, which condemned the philosophical line of the journal under the banner of Marxism and ordered a change of editorial board. At the height of the conflict between Deborin and the three-party ideologists, Stalin intervened in the controversy. On December 9, 1930, he appeared in the office of the party cell of the Institute of Red Professors and, during the meeting, coined the expression, quote, Menshevizing idealism, end quote, to describe Deborin's view. Stalin's phrase about, quote, Menshevizing idealism was in fact meaningless, but as it linked Deborin's views with two movements which Soviet terminology branded as counter-revolutionary and reactionary, it could be used against an opponent who could not be accused of any concrete misdemeanors. In this capacity, the concept, quote, Menshevizing idealism, end quote, had continued to exist in Soviet terminology up to the present day. I believe this book is from the early 1960s. It only remains to be said that the resolution of the 25th of January 1931 liquidated one of the most interesting phenomena in Soviet philosophy. Pilloried by the party, Deborin and his school were submerged by a flood of suspicions and insults. Under pressure from the party and debarred from all active occupations, the Deborinists either took to self-criticism and turned into fierce critics of their former convictions, like I.K. Lupal, who vanished in the 30s, or V.F. Asmus, who is still writing today, or else they remained firm in spite of the drive against them. In that case, they had to endure trial for, quote, counter-revolutionary activities, quote, like B.N. Gessen and Y.E. Sten. Or else they retired completely from public life, voluntarily or under pressure, and became silent forever. Deborin had a twofold fate. It was noticeable that during the last months of the controversy, Deborin kept back and after the May Declaration published nothing in his own defense. It is said that on January 1st, 1931, he made a complete confession of his guilt before the Society of Militant Materialists and Dialecticians. It may be that when his followers were censored, his early self-criticism saved him from anything worse than losing control of the journal under the banner of Marxism. Deborin was allowed to keep all his other public positions. Some years later, he was even elected to the Presidium of the Academy of Sciences and remained there until the end of the Second World War. As Deborin admitted later, in 1933, in a long self-critical speech at the Institute of Philosophy, Deborin had not finally abandoned his philosophical convictions in 1931. Quote, Our fundamental mistake, end quote, Deborin said, quote, lay in separating theory and practice. I had mentioned that for a long time I did not understand that accusation, because after all I was constantly speaking of practice as the criterion of truth. I was speaking about it and writing about it. Only later did I understand that this was not at all what was at stake. The essence of the matter was that we failed to establish a connection between our theoretical and methodological investigations and the concrete tasks of socialist construction, we separated theory from life. This led to a state where some of the Menshevizing idealists developed to a certain degree into, quote, inner emigrants, end quote, and later into political opportunists, end quote. Deborin. Turning to his former followers, he demanded from them, quote, complete and unconditional surrender, end quote. This, he thought, was the only possible decision for an honest communist. Even though Deborin bought his personal security and part of his public position with his, quote, unconditional surrender, the few of his articles which appeared after 1933 are devoid of any independent thought. They do not differ in any way from dozens of similarly nondescript productions. After disowning his philosophy, he had really nothing else to say. He appears uncertain and indulges in false radicalism. His articles, Karl Marx in the Present, of 1933 and Lenin and the President of 1934 are nondescript treatises in party jargon. After 1934, he turned almost completely away from philosophical subjects. For example, in the articles N.A. Dobrolubov, 1936, and I.P. Pavlov and Materialism, 1936, and Bourgeois or Socialist Humanism of 1937, or he repeated the party's political slogans, for example, in the articles Warmongers Campaign Against National Sovereignty, 1951, and The Agency of American Imperialism of 1953. Whenever during the last years he ventured into the realm of philosophy, he wrote about such out-of-the-way subjects as materialism and the dialectic in ancient Indian philosophy, published in 1956. His latest article, titled Leibniz as a Social Thinker, appeared in the Prose Philosophy, 1961. The dialectical philosophy which Deborin and his disciples developed during the 20s has remained unique in the Soviet Union on account of its philosophical originality and intellectual range. Since then, no worthwhile attempt has been made to work out an independent Soviet philosophy. An independent Soviet philosophy, unaffected by the political interests of the Communist Party, or to revive the traditions of the early days. After 1931, dialectical materialism became canonized and was turned into rigid dogma. Since then, all works on philosophical questions has remained within the narrow limits of a general line which even lays down the choice of words. And that's the end of the essay or chapter, The Forgotten Philosopher, Abram Deborin, by René Ahlberg. Thank you so much for listening.